A very warm welcome to everybody to this series of webinars in which we're exploring this question that we all ask ourselves at some point in our life and perhaps even throughout our life is, what does it mean to live well? And we're exploring that in a way of kind of building blocks, foundation stones, milestones, if you like. And this is number 6. Which is called How We React to Stress and Difficulties. But when we get to this point, we've already put a whole set of building blocks in place. We've learned fundamentally how important it is to reclaim our attention, to intentionally reclaim our attention, to live a life well. That's one of the first prerequisites. Having done that, we begin to have choices about where we place our attention. And if we ask ourselves a question about what brings us joy, what do we have a sense of appreciation in our life, we can begin to choose to place our attention there, to notice those moments. And having done that, we've had this sense of what is the value of really coming to know and embody our mind-body? Because it can be an anchor, it can be a sanctuary, it can be a guide, it can be a teacher. And all the while, as we're doing that work, we're cultivating in the same way that a gardener would cultivate a garden. We're cultivating these qualities of friendliness in our body-mind. Friendliness imbued with curiosity, with interest, with kindness, with care, with a sense of appreciation and awesomeness sometimes, but also friendly care around difficulties and challenges that we have. And all of that is being put in place today to begin to ask, how can we recognize moments of reactivity? And what do I mean by that? How we habitually react to stress and difficulties, why we develop unhelpful habits, and how we can begin, when we recognize that, to respond more wisely. So that's today. And let me start with a question. When something difficult happens, how do you tend to react? What do I mean by that? What are your go-to ways of coping when you feel bored or sad, or you encounter anything you don't like? What are the kind of, what trips off? What are the things that you typically would do? Pretty common ones, see if they sound familiar, are escaping into our phone or gaming, keeping busy, withdrawing into our shell, maybe retail therapy for some people. I remember one day after a long day at work, I was grabbing a snack late one night and my daughter says to me, "Dad, you can't eat your feelings." Kids can be tough, right? And they can say things that can be quite to the point sometimes. And of course, she was quite right. For me, that eating was a form of comfort eating. And these are all incredibly familiar, incredibly understandable, very human ways of coping. Now, what I want to do is today unpack that a little bit and show, first of all, why we do this, and then maybe begin to explore the ways in which this does, but really importantly also doesn't serve us. So my work, along with Christina Feldman, has been drawing on ancient wisdom, Buddhist psychology, and contemporary psychological science to try and come up with understandings of, for today's webinar, reactivity. So what I'm going to do now is do a little bit of kind of the science or the background of reactivity and give 3 accounts of why we do these things. Why do we stick our head in the sand? Why do we reach for the cookie jar? Why do we keep busy? Why do we escape into our phone? And the first account I want to give is one that is more than 2,500 years old. And it's a really, really simple teaching. And I think it's a teaching that distills a huge amount of richness and wisdom into a very simple metaphor. It's the Buddhist story of the two arrows. All distress, all suffering, this story relays, comprises two arrows. The first arrow is something that we can do nothing about. So, for example, if I touch a hot plate, my hand burns, and that is a very natural and something I can do nothing about. And I'll retract my hand. That's the first arrow. Someone I love is sad. And when I see that person I love being sad, I have a sense of feeling empathy and wanting out to reach towards them. Again, a first arrow. It's unavoidable. The hot plate, the person who's sad. But the teaching's richness is in what the Buddha describes as the second arrow, which is what is the layer that we layer on top of that first arrow? What is our reaction to that first arrow? And typically, this will be things like rumination, avoidance, numbing, self-criticism. So take the hand on the hot plate. We could just take our hand away. We could put it under a cold tap. Or someone might say, oh, I'm such a stupid idiot. What did I do that for? Why did I not see that? This is the second arrow. It's the story we tell ourselves. And the richness of this metaphor, of course, is that this second arrow also often happens very quickly, and often there's a whole series of arrows, but it's optional. We fire these second arrows, perhaps automatically, reactively, but they are, at the end of the day, automatic. The two arrows. The second bit of science that I want to draw on is something which people find quite surprising, and it's a sort of evolutionary bias in the brain for reactivity. We evolved, of course, as everybody knows, to survive, but crucially, we didn't really evolve to be happy. Happiness in and of itself doesn't necessarily confer evolutionary advantage. And it can be really helpful to think of these habits, these autopilot type things that we can do in a spirit of habit and reactivity as being deep wired in terms of evolutionary survival value. Our habits of avoidance, of anxiety and control were once helpful for our survival. But modern life has different challenges. What's happening now, instead of a sort of first arrow of a challenge that we need to meet immediately, so we're in a sort of social grouping and there's some threat to us, to our place in the hierarchy, or potentially even our place in the group, this is a first arrow. The second arrow then is the worry about it, the kind of rumination about it, the stories we tell ourselves about it. And our modern life is full of things that can drive these second arrows. Deadlines, emails, social media, uncertainty, a realm of information that we would, in previous, as little as 50, 100 years ago, we would simply not have had access to. And then the third thing that I'd like to just point to it draws on sort of behavioral psychology, and I think it's incredibly sort of powerful psychological theory that can help us understand why we do these things that maybe help us in the short term, but we know deep down that they don't serve us. Everything we learn at some level, we learn because it's been associated with something else, or it's been reinforced. We've learned that if we do this, it makes us feel a bit better, so we do it again, and gosh, it makes us feel better again. This is positive reinforcement. So if I'll just give a couple of examples. I was sitting at a cafe the other day, and there was a family sitting at a table with a dog. And the dog would look up at the people at the table who were eating, and he would bark. And they go, "Oh, shush, leave us alone," and just keep barking. And um, eventually they'd give in and they'd give the dog a bit of food. And what's happening there, of course, is the dog is barking and learning that when he barks, he's going to be reinforced with food. But what the people at the table probably don't realize that the most powerful form of positive reinforcement is intermittent reinforcement. When we know this from extensive behavioral psychology, that if you reinforce something repeatedly with every single occasion, the learning is less strong than intermittent reinforcement. And I was in a bookshop at the weekend and I saw the very same thing happening with a child and his parents who was whining, sort of very whiny voice. You know it when you hear it, right? And you could see the parents were looking irritable and trying to ignore it. And eventually they gave in and gave the child what they had been asking for all the while. Exactly the same thing is happening. But the other part of this kind of behavioral psychology piece, which is so, so important for us to understand, is this idea of not positive reinforcement. If I do this, then this good thing happens. But if I do this, then this bad thing goes away. Let me say that again. So something bad is happening. And if I do this, that bad thing goes away. This is called negative reinforcement. And if that sounds a bit difficult to wrap our heads around, let me give you a couple of examples. I'm feeling kind of bored and a bit antsy. So I pick up my phone and I go to my favorite app and I start scrolling through. And I've taken myself away from the boredom and the antsiness. There are numerous examples of this, and I would say that the very large number of kind of second arrows that we tend to fire have perhaps been learned through negative reinforcement. It doesn't mean they're bad, because of course they've been functional at some point in our lives. So, reactivity, these things that we do to cope with difficulty and stress that help and are very much part of the human condition and totally understandable, but we know don't serve us in the long term. So what I'd like to do is invite you now into kind of an exercise in which we can explore this reactivity a little bit for ourselves. It's called the vicious flower exercise. And if you've never heard of this before, just follow along with the instructions. And if you've done it before, just see if you can drop into it in a way, a spirit of kind of curiosity and interest to see what else you might discover. And I'll come back to this a little bit later, but this is really an inquiry for life. So if you've done this before, this is maybe a way of coming at it from a different angle. So bring to mind a recent situation that was a bit tricky, a bit stressful, and it's the kind of situation you know that tends to trip you up. It feels sort of familiar and I'm going to say archetypal, but what I mean by that, it's the sort of thing that you know, this is the sort of thing that gets me or that winds me up. Bring it to mind, sharpen the image, just see if you can just bring yourself back into that situation, perhaps as if it's happening in your mind's eye just now. What's your first reaction? What's happening in your body? Can you notice any kind of bodily reaction? Just scan through the body and maybe give some words to different parts of the body. Is there a kind of emotional tone, a kind of feeling state that's around? And have you got like a call to action? Is there a sense of wanting to pull back or freeze or move into action? Maybe there's some kind of thinking or imagery or strategizing that's going on. So you've just taken note of what's happened in this situation, in your body, emotionally, in terms of your impulses, in terms of your imagery and thoughts. And here's the next part, the next question. What do you do to try and fix this situation, to try and sort this situation, to try and feel better, to get rid of the difficulty? What's your kind of almost like habitual, reactive kind of impulse, what you feel like doing? And what else? And what else? And just see if you can come up with maybe one, two, three things that you did. And then allow yourself to cast back your mind to other kinds of situations that were similar, perhaps. Were there other things that you did in those situations? Okay, and now just step back a little bit, just kind of take a different perspective, just looking back on the situation and ask yourself, did those things that you did they help? Did they serve you? And did they serve you in the short term, immediately as the situation unfolded? And did they serve you in the medium term over the next hour, the rest of the day, the next day, maybe even over a period of weeks and months? So why is it called a vicious flower? It's called a vicious flower because in this stressful, difficult, challenging situation, the center of the flower is what happens for us immediately, the kind of coalescence of what's happening in our body, emotionally, behaviorally, our thinking, the kind of what's sometimes called the four-part model or the hot cross bun. And because that's not a nice place to be, we very understandably trip into what can I do? How can I fix this? How can I feel better? And the strategies that we use that emerge out of this center are like the kind of lines or petals out of the flower. Now, sometimes these are helpful. It's a bit like a dandelion, they feed away from the flower. But sometimes, if we ask ourselves the question, so with my daughter, when she says, Dad, you're eating your feelings, and I know deep down, of course, that she's right, doesn't really help. Feel a little bit better, the sweetness of the cookie or whatever it is. But I know afterwards I'm going to feel a bit not great about using that as a way of coping. So that's a sense of that coming back, and that's an example of negative reinforcement. The cookie is giving me temporary relief from feeling a bit antsy, feeling whatever. And very typical, petals of a sort of vicious flower have got these kind of characteristics. And see if you can recognize these in what you came up with. Straightforward avoidance. It's not nice. I want to avoid it. Typically diving into distractions. And we have developed a fantastic array of these, from our phones to work to alcohol to shopping to gaming to gambling. There's any array of these distractions. Because we have this incredible capacity for thinking, our thinking mind, we also try and puzzle and think our way out of it, often overthinking with rumination, worry, mentally replaying the event, if only this, if only that. Emotional numbing, withdrawing, shutting down, stonewalling. And then, of course, sometimes also a sense of really kind of over control, over preparing, perfectionism, trying to fix everything immediately. So, just before I leave this sort of section of recognizing reactivity with these sort of vicious flower exercises, something we can do over and over again in our lives is ask ourselves that question of what's happening here? What am I doing? Is it serving me? But I'll just give an example. I'll come back to this in a moment. Of a character in the book who I developed throughout the book called Sophia, who was a school teacher. And she had something which I think many of us can perhaps identify with, which is that somewhere within the kind of, I don't know, the architecture of who she was, if you like, there was a sort of sense of an inner critic. And she gave the example of texting a friend to ask for some feedback on some teaching that she'd done, a colleague. And when the colleague didn't text back immediately, she had this sense of a kind of a collapse and a sense of anxiety in her stomach and a sense of, oh no, my friend doesn't know what to say. She thinks that my teaching wasn't very good and that her feedback is negative. And what Sophia would do as one of her kind of strategies was the control strategy. So she would massively over prepare her teaching, strive for perfection, and trying to fix everything that she could to maximize the chances of her teaching being excellent. And actually, in her teaching career, she went to quite high levels in her teaching career, was an excellent teacher, but it was always on this edifice of a fear of her inner critic being exposed rather than a joy in teaching, a love of learning. The very famous rugby player, Johnny Wilkinson, has written also about the same thing, that he helped, for anybody who knows about rugby from about, gosh, 20 or so years ago, he, in a sort of very famous kind of drop kick in the final minute of the World Cup final, won England the World Cup. And even up to the whole of that period, he was famous for really preparing everything he did to an incredibly high standard, fantastic sportsman. But he talked about crippling anxiety that drove his kind of perfectionism and his need to do all these things well, that he has since retirement, and he's written about this and talked about this, tried to unpack. And Sophia was the same on a less kind of global stage, if you like, with her teaching. So this reactivity with these kinds of three drivers or ways of understanding it, the two arrows, the brain's evolutionary predisposition to be reactive, if you like, and behavioral learning theory as a way of understanding what's happening. The minute we kind of can recognize it and understand it, we've created the idea of the possibility of change. And I want to say a little bit about some of the ways in which we can begin to create the possibility of change. And I'd like to start with the breathing space. And maybe we can do this in this moment, is to right now, and I'll do this I'll guide this breathing space in a way that it can be exported and fully integrated into our lives. So in step one, just very simply in this moment, checking in. What's happening in my body and mind? This may be a word or two or three to describe the landscape of your body-mind right now. And then when you're ready, having registered that, allowing that to be on the register, so to speak, but very intentionally, very deliberately, the skill that you've developed, gather and anchor your awareness on your breath, wherever in this moment supports a sense of gathering and anchoring. Gathering your awareness and with this crucial dimension of friendliness, with this register in the background of whatever's the landscape of the body-mind, anchoring awareness, but imbuing that awareness with an attitude of interest, kindness, and care. You're choosing in this moment, take your awareness, to take your attention, place it somewhere in your body, mind, wherever you're choosing to place it, gathering, anchoring with this quality of friendliness. Then in the third step, just broadening out. And broadening out here with a real sense of openness and equanimity. This is qualities that we'll come on to in webinars to come, but with a real sense of you open to whatever you'd registered before in the body mind, but maybe also to anything that's pleasant around just now. Something that's pleasant in your body, something that's pleasant in your thinking right now, that's pleasant in whatever space you're in right now. But because you're broadening out the landscape, you're broadening the awareness, including also anything that's unpleasant. See if you can meet this with a quality of care, patience. So this first crucial step of transforming reactivity always starts with this sort of, I'll call it very simply, just mindful recognition. Recognition, if you like, with a quality of allowing, with a quality of friendliness. And the three-step breathing space is precisely that. Oh, what is this? Step one, anchoring, gathering. Step two. And instead of course, reactivities are narrowing and it's a sort of vortex and going down this vortex. And what you're doing with step three is a broadening and an opening out. So this is the first part. Now, the second part, and again, what I was saying right at the beginning of the webinar, it's this idea of we're building and building and building. And the next thing that I want to suggest that we're building in this sense of transforming reactivity is the 50-50 practice. So we begin the 50-50 practice just in interpersonal, I say just, but in that really important domain of listening and speaking. But you can generalize the 50-50 practice into any area of your life. All it means is keeping a part of your awareness in yourself, in your body, mind, and part of your awareness to whatever's unfolding in this moment, be that with another person, be that with whatever had come up for you in that moment of reactivity. You're staying present in your body, mind. And remember what I said right at the beginning about what is it that we've learned about the body, mind? Well, that it can be an anchor, it can be a sanctuary, it can be a guide, it can be a teacher. And if we bring in a sense of presence into these moments, the 50-50 practice can be all of those things: an anchor, a sanctuary, a guide, and a teacher. So what I'd like to do now is to just illustrate this a little bit, because this is all quite my voice and my stories and my way of describing things. And I want to give the microphone to the three characters in my book, Mindfulness for Life. Sophia, talking about her inner critic, Sam, talking about his phone, and Ling, talking about a meeting at work. And just give me a second while I just share my screen so that I can do this. Okay, so let me just share my screen. So you'll just hear a tiny bit of my voice for a few minutes because this is me just setting this up and couldn't get to quite the right space. And then you'll hear Sophia describing her experience next.
Full flow can be a brilliant teacher. Maybe the next time you experience a vicious flower taking form, try taking a breathing space.
Yesterday, I asked a colleague for feedback, and when they didn't reply immediately, my mind did its worst. There I was, in the grip of my inner critic. So I did a breathing space. If I'm honest, I felt terrible, hopeless, stuck. It didn't help at all. It made it worse in a way. What familiar territory, the knot in my stomach, reliving past failures, being so down on myself and reaching for the cookie jar. Oh, how many years have I lived with this critic? When it takes hold, I literally feel locked in, trapped.
I couldn't help but.
So this is really important to say that actually what Sophia is saying is that pausing and taking a breathing space for her, and this is really important, of course, for us to know about the breathing space, is in no sense is it intended to fix anything. That's not the purpose of it. It's a way of bringing a pause and tuning into what's happening. And for her, what we can see is that actually that's not very nice. And that helps us understand also why she reached for the cookie jar. But that is always still the first step. So what we're going on to now is Sam, who's a young man in his 20s, and he is an intensive care nurse. And this is him talking about, I think he's talking about his bus journey home.
Crack a smile. I did it on the bus on the way home. A tough shift at work. One of my patients had died. We hadn't been able to get a handle on her pain. It was brutal. And just when I thought this can't get worse, there was a pointless management meeting after the shift. Managers can be so bureaucratic and heartless. So there I am on the bus, just wanting to vanish into my phone. Played a game, decided to take a ninja. That's what I call your breathing spaces. I looked up and it was insane. Almost everyone on the bus was glued to their phone. Totally zoned out from the world. I had to smile. It felt like we're all in this together, part of the same human family, you know? Each of us just trying to do our best, finding our escapes and bits of happiness where we can. I'm not gonna lie. I went back to my phone, but with a smile on my face.
I had him.
What I love about Sam's account is this sense of playfulness, right? So he's renamed the breathing spaces Ninja. This is something I heard from a friend of mine that he learned actually as a boy. And he's just playful with it and he's very permissive with it. And this final one now is Ling, and she's describing how she copes with a meeting at work. Ling is a woman who works as a court reporter in a court.
Meeting with my boss. His style is so grating. I get more and more irritated and usually leave the meeting in a bad mood. I tried doing a breathing space before the meeting, and I said to myself, try keeping 50% of your attention in your body during the meeting. I was still irritated and noticed my shoulders tightened, my jaw contracted, my breathing was shallower. Not nice. But recognizing it stopped my irritability from spiraling into a foul mood. I was still irritated, but I wasn't going to let it ruin my day. I was quietly proud of myself. And at the end of the day, when we were finishing up, a colleague who I get on with quite well said, "What's going on with you, Ling? You seem different."
The breathing space.
So let me just unshare my screen if I can figure out how to do that. I can't quite figure it out. Oh, there I can. So what I love about Ling's account is that sense of taking the breathing space and morphing it into a 50-50 practice in her meeting with her boss. And that sense of reactivity being like a chaining, like a kind of chaining of events unfolding. First of all, the sort of coalescence of what's happening, the irritability with him, and and then the various vicious flowers. And what she's saying is that the breathing space, the 50-50 practice, broke those chains. It enabled her to begin to have the space potentially to respond differently. So the 3-step breathing space just really integrated into our lives, broadened into a sense of it becoming 50-50 practices that we can use at any moment. And then the third thing I want to just point to is this idea that is one of many things we can do, but one that I think many people say is just so simple yet profoundly transformative, which is the way in which we bring awareness to walking is so powerfully a way of bringing us out of our heads, out of reactivity, out of elaboration, out of avoidance, into the very simple and embodied sense of our body in movement, in contact with the ground, feeling our steps, our breath, our body, with a sense of appreciation. It's a very, very simple and very powerful way of potentially shifting from reactivity into presence. And lots of people have developed a way of actually integrating walking into their everyday lives, or at moments where they really need to come out of that kind of vortex of reactivity into their body. So I want to just end with a sense of this being an exploration for life. And in the book Mindfulness for Life, every topic, and the topic of today is kind of reactivity, recognizing and understanding it, is something that we can begin to learn about. And then in a sort of sense of taking that learning further, we can explore for a lifetime. And I've talked a few times during the kind of webinars about my own experience of depression since my teenage years. And I, in terms of recognizing various sort of facets of depression starting, have over the years shifted from the kind of the little sort of micro moments of that, like waking early in the middle of the night and not being able to get back to sleep, or a sense of irritability, or sort of thoughts that are sort of very negative and familiar territory of depression, to doing the same as many people with a history of depression or all sorts of mental things, challenges can do, which is to give it a name. Famously, Winston Churchill gave his depression the name Black Dog. You know, people love their dogs, and it was a sense of having a sense of his dog being present so he could communicate to his wife that he was going through a difficult time, so she could relate to him with that understanding. And for me, I call it my swamp. I call it my swamp. And when you think of swamp, you might think, oh my gosh, that's a bit smelly and gurgly and horrible. But actually, I've come to see the swamp as being a sort of signature of a part of me and my life that is part of something actually much bigger. If you think about a rainforest or even a swamp, every rainforest will have swampy areas, and that swamp is a place where trees grow out of and oxygen and carbon dioxide get regenerated. It's an absolutely integral part of any rainforest. And I can understand from the swamp then things like the root system, the wanting, the craving, the things I mentioned before, the double arrows, the learning history, the things I learned growing up. I lived in Nigeria until the age of 9, surrounded by incredible poverty, incredible suffering, really quite scary military coups. And for a young child, that was part of the sort of learning history that is the root system, if you like, the kind of underpinning of these vicious flowers. So if you just to develop this metaphor of the vicious flower, it's got a kind of root system, and that root system is something that we can explore. Very often we'll have developed rules for living. Some of them are conditional. If I do this, then that. And underneath those, and deep in the root system, underneath the rainforest, they're often around things like lovability and worth. So all I'm saying here is that the vicious flower is something that can be explored for a time. It can be befriended. It can be named. Sophia called it her inner critic. I've called my depression my swamp. And that can be transformed into rules for living that actually feel more functional, core beliefs that feel more wholesome, that feel more healthy, value systems that guide, like a compass, how we respond at moments that might have been triggers for vicious flowers in the past. And then the final part of the exploration is this sense of vicious flowers sitting as part of a wider ecosystem, always as part of a wider ecosystem. That moment of the inner critic, or for me, of a swampiness, or whatever came up for you, sits within a context of your friends, your family, your community, the prevailing culture of family. That can be explored. And one of the exercises that we'll come on to later is a sense of which aspects of our lives, of our friendships, of our work pattern, nourish us or deplete us. In my case, make the swamp become larger or contain it, grow the different parts of the ecosystem of the rainforest. So I want to just close with a kind of a sense, if you like, of possibility. There was a Greek philosopher that actually predated Socrates, Heraclitus. And there's this phrase from one of his writings, which I think really speaks to this sense of exploring vicious flowers and beginning to cultivate a different way. So he wrote, into the same rivers we step and do not step. We are and are not. Every moment is a chance to respond differently. Let me read the first part of that again. Into the same rivers we step and do not step. We are and we are not. And I think my understanding of this passage is what he's saying is that if you think of a river, you think of a body of water and you think of it being in movement, and it maybe has a name and it has a quality. But actually that river is never the same because that body of water is never the same. That river is always changing. So just to take that metaphor, that is the conditions in which we are living our lives. And of course, we step into that river, but the swamp that might come up for me today won't be the same swamp that came up for me last week or whatever. Every one of those times is a little bit different. The prevailing conditions are different. We're a little bit different. And if we can have that sense that we really open up with a sense of curiosity of what am I seeing here? What am I experiencing here? What's happening here? What are the prevailing conditions? It has that, instead of saying, this is me, or this is my swamp, or this is my black dog, or this is my inner critic, or this is my pain, or whatever it might be, it begins to loosen, it begins to open, and it begins to open up the possibility of responding differently. So reactivity is normal. Trying to explain why we do this in terms of ancient wisdom, the two arrows, and modern neuroscience and psychology. It's part of the human condition, and we've learned it. We do it for very good reasons. But the question, does this serve me, is such a helpful question in the medium term and the long term. And when we pause, and this will be the topic of future webinars, we can begin to choose new responses. And again, the topic of future webinars, new responses that maybe align with our values. So I'd like to just end, if you'll allow me to, with a sort of call to action. In the next 24 hours, see if in these moments of potential reactivity, you can try one of these three practices. The 3-step breathing space, the 50-50 practice, coming into walking. And in this spirit of stepping into the river, knowing that the river is different and I'm different, just ask this question of, is there a way of being different in this moment? Both in terms of seeing the conditions of the prevailing moment, but also seeing who we are in that moment. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll stop there.